The suffocating silence of the room buzzed faintly with the tension of desperation. Number 230 adjusted the zipper of their green tracksuit, trying to calm the erratic pounding of their heart. Every player here had a reason. Debts, losses, failures, but for them, the stakes felt sharper. Survival wasn't just about escaping death. It was about escaping a secret, a life that they'd carried inside themselves for years. They glanced around, looking at the Squid Game players. The drab of fluorescent lights overhead the highlighted faces, drawn and weary from sleepless nights and death at every turn. And then their heart froze mid-beat. Him. Even after all this time, they recognized him instantly. Thanos, number 212. His tall, broad frame loomed in one corner of the room, effortlessly commanding attention even as he sat with his head lowered. His dark eyes filtered across the space, his sharp and calculating gaze. The last time they'd seen those eyes, they'd been filled with anger and betrayal. Months before everything had fallen apart, months before they found out they were pregnant. It had been years since then, years since they'd given birth alone in a tiny hospital with no one to hold their hand. Years spent struggling to build something from the rubble of their heartbreak, only to find themselves crumbling once again beneath the weight of bad decisions. Debt piled higher than any of them could manage, leaving them trapped in this deadly game. And now there he was. They ducked their head, trying to not draw his gaze, but it was too late. Thanos had looked up, his eyes locked to theirs like a predator, catching the scent of his small prey. His lips tightened as he stood up, his towering frame cutting effortlessly through the crowd as he approached. "Lion?" he said. They couldn't bring themselves to look up. Their stomach was churned in a mix of emotion, something they couldn't quite place on what it was. Fear, anger, longing. Thanos, they said, forcing the name out like it burned their throat. He crouched down to their level, eyes narrowing as he studied their face. He looked older, harder, but beneath the cold demeanor they recognized something familiar. Concern. "What are you doing here?" His voice was tight with disbelief. "Why the hell did you get yourself involved in this?" Wayne clenched their fists. "I could ask you the same thing." "That's not an answer." His tone hardened, but Ryan snapped their gaze to him, cutting him off. I didn't have a choice, okay? Some of us don't." He leaned back, frowning deeply. His silence spoke volumes. It always had. Ryan had once loved his quiet strength and his ability to say so much without even speaking, but now it just felt suffocating. And yet they couldn't ignore the flicker of warmth in their chest from seeing him. It wasn't fair. None of this was fair. "Are you..." He cut himself off, hesitating. Something flickered in his eyes. Doubt. Worry. "You look different." Ryan tensed. "What's that supposed to mean?" You know what I mean. You've changed." "Yeah, people change, Thanos. It's been years. I'm not the same person I was, and neither are you." He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Look, I didn't come here to argue, but we need to stick together if we're going to survive this." Ryan's instinct was to reject him. They wanted to just protect themselves, to keep up the walls they had built, but then they thought of their child, the quiet mornings, the little giggles, and the big brown eyes, so much like the man standing in front of them. The games were ruthless, and every day brought them closer to the truth that they could no longer ignore. If they died, their child would be an orphan. "Fine," they murmured. Thanos arched a brow, clearly surprised by the lack of resistance. He gave a curt nod. "We'll talk later," he said, before quietly leaving. He rose to walk away, leaving Wyan to wrestle with the temptress swirling inside them. The third game ended, leaving less than half the original group standing. Wyan sat against a wall, the dim dormitory shivering as their exhaustion caught up to them. Thanos approached, sitting behind them with an uncharacteristic hesitancy. For a moment, neither of them spoke. You've always been strong, he said, voice finally softer now. Even when everything fell apart, I always admitted saying that about you. Wyan snorted, wondering what the hell he was up to. You're saying this now? I'm saying it because it's true, he replied. And because seeing you here. His voice trailed off, and he stared at the ground, his fist tightening on his knees. It kills me to think how close I came to losing you without ever getting to fix what I broke. Wyan felt the anger rise in their chest, because it was bubbling, and they just couldn't contain it. You left me, Thanos. You walked away without even trying to understand. You lied to me, he shot back, his voice rising. Then he caught himself glancing around at the other players watching curiously. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. You lied. You kept things from me. Wyan's breath hitched. They knew what he meant, the debt, the secrets, but it just wasn't about that. I wasn't lying to hurt you, they said, their voice trembling. I was trying to protect us, and I made mistakes, okay, but I wasn't the only one. He flinched, his jaw clenching. He didn't respond, and for a moment they just stared at each other, the weight of their shared history pressing down like a physical force. Finally, Wyan spoke, their voice barely a whisper. You know what's really ironic? I was pregnant when you left. Thanos froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. What? You heard me, they said bitterly. I didn't know then either. I found out a month later, and by that time you were already gone. The color drained from his face as the words sank in. You serious? He whispered. I'm not making it up. He opened his mouth and closed it, shaking, as if trying to process what he just learned. He shook his head. Why didn't you? He trailed off. I didn't think you'd care. His head snapped up. His expression was a mix of anger and heartbreak. Don't say that. Don't you dare think that. Well, what was I supposed to think, Thanos? You left me, and I had no idea where you were. And I wasn't just about to drag you into a mess you didn't want to be a part of. The air between them grew heavy. The silence. For the first time, Thanos looked genuinely shaken. The man was so cocky and so... God, I didn't even know how to explain it. Smug, maybe? But he looked genuinely shaken. I have a child, he said finally, his voice barely audible. Wyan nodded. Yes. And they're the reason I'm here. I need to get out of this for them. Alive. Thanos leaned back against the wall, running a hand over his face. What's their name? He asked. Lee? Wyan whispered. They're around 3 years old now. A faint smile flickered across his lips, a bittersweet feeling. Lee. He let the name linger on his tongue, and then his expression hardened, determination blaring in his eyes. We're getting out of here, Wyan. Both of us. For them. They stared at the man they'd once loved and lost. For the first time in years, they felt a glimmer of hope. Okay, they said, unsure. And for the first time since the game started, they believed it might actually be possible. The fourth games had been worse than anyone could have predicted. Wyan sat against the cold concrete, just waiting. The concrete wall of the dormitory pierced into their back. They clutched their side as blood seeped through their tracksuit. Their vision blurred with pain. They were alive for now, but Thanos crouched in front of them, his face carved into a sharp edge of worry that he didn't bother to mask. "You need to let me see," he said firmly, already tugging at the hem of their tracksuit to examine the wound. "It's not that bad," Lion murmured, wincing. Thanos couldn't even give them a pointed glare. "You can't even sit up straight. Don't tell me this isn't anything." His hands were surprisingly gentle as they peeled back the blood-soaked fabric. Lion hissed in pain, their fingers twitching against the ground. They weren't even sure how they'd gotten hurt. Everything just felt like a blur. But now the full weight of their injury was setting in. The fiery stab of pain every breath told them it wasn't minor. "It's a gash, but it doesn't look deep enough to hit anything vital," Thanos muttered. "Still, it'll get infected if we don't treat it." William grimaced. "Do you see a first aid kit lying around? Nobody's out here handing supplies over for free." Thanos straightened, his jaw tight. "Stay here." "Where are you?" "Stay here." He stalked off before they could even protest, and Ryan's stomach churned with unease. The rules of the Squid Games left little room for generosity or camaraderie. If Thanos picked a fight over supplies, he'd make himself a target. With the way he stood out, he definitely didn't need any of the extra attention. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last, until he returned with a strip of fabric that looked like an antiseptic. "Where did you get that?" Wayne asked warily. He didn't answer, instead kneeling to soak the fabric in this antiseptic. His silence was louder than any words ever could have been. "Thanos?" He shook his head, simply meeting their eyes. "You don't need to know. Just stay still." Wayne wanted to argue, but the pain drained their resolve. They let him work, clenching their teeth in pain as he continued his precise cleaning with almost a maddening way of he moved his hands. "Breathe," Thanos murmured. His tone was surprisingly soothing. "I am breathing," Wyan said through clenched teeth. He smirked faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You always gotta get snarky. Guess some things don't change." Silence fell again as he wrapped the makeshift bandage tightly around their torso. His fingers lingered for a moment, brushing against their skin as if grounding himself. "All done," he said softly. "And you'll live." "Thanks to you, I guess," Wyan replied, the voice softening as the gravity of the moment settled over them. "You didn't have to do that. You could have just focused on yourself and saved your strength." He leaned back on his heels, studying them with an intensity that made their chest ache. "Do you really think I'd let you bleed out?" he asked, his voice raw. "After everything we've been through, after everything you've just told me." Ryan looked away, unsure of how to respond. Thanos continued, "When you told me about Lee, it changed me. This wasn't just about survival. If I make it out of here, I know there's a chance to..." He stopped, running a hand over his face. "I want to fix things. For you. For Lee." Ryan's throat tightened. They wanted to tell him that that just wasn't enough. That it wasn't that simple, that years of hurt couldn't be patched up with promises and good intentions, but beneath the doubt, a small part of them wanted to believe him. "We still have to make it out here," Ryan said quietly. "If we're lucky, we'll get that far." "We will," he responded. His tone was resolute, his gaze steady. "But only if you don't get yourself killed. No more reckless moves." "Reckless?" "First of all, don't question me on being reckless when you are who you are. And I was trying to stay alive, Thanos." "You're staying alive now because I stepped in," he countered, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Do you realize what I felt when I saw you bleeding out and I thought I was going to lose you again?" The vulnerability in his voice took Wine by surprise, silencing their rebuttal.
I'm sorry, they said.
The voice was quiet but genuine. His expression softened. Whatever, just promise me you'll let me protect you. Wine met his eyes, something unspoken passing between them. Yeah.
Okay. Deal.